Hello again, it's Glenn Kaminsky in our 8th and last segment dealing with the Field Training and Evaluation Program. In this last segment, we're going to be touching on termination issues, liability issues, and close with what I term the 10 reasons for implementing the program in your agency. Let me begin with termination, although that ought to be the last tool in our toolbox. Termination is unfortunate for everybody, but in this program, our role is to determine those people that are qualified for the job and to identify those people who are unqualified and to make the recommendations for termination after, of course, we've provided all the remedial training that we can think of, and that remedial training has not worked. In terms of the liability issues, we are particularly concerned with those high level liability issues, and those are the ones that usually lead to recommendations for termination. As an example, seldom do we find it difficult or impossible to teach somebody report writing. But somebody who has difficulty with officer safety, certainly their behavior is fraught with liability for the organization as well as safety concerns for the people that work with them. Persons that behave much like that are more likely the ones that are going to be recommended for termination. So as we get into this list of liability areas that I'm going to run down for you, keep in mind that we're not talking about somebody who perhaps makes a mistake in spelling in a report right, or reporting situation, or somebody that might make a minor error in terms of remembering the element of a particular crime. We're talking about people whose behavior is such that clearly, if it continues, if it's replicated, if we can't resolve that behavior and fix it, then we're going to have to do something as an organization in terms of terminating that individual. I might also say when we discuss the termination process that termination is unpleasant for everyone. But if we look at it realistically, it is a win-win situation. The organization wins because no longer are they retaining somebody who is unable to do the job or unqualified in that position. The individual indirectly wins because they don't end up being a square peg in a round hole, being in a position in an organization that it's unlikely that they'll ever advance, and in fact may end up being the subject of a suit if their behavior is unacceptable, subject of a suit in addition to the organization. What I'd like to do now is go through a series of areas of liability. By no means all the areas of liability that an organization might be concerned with, but certainly those that have some sort of a relationship to the FTO program. The first one that I'd like to discuss is called negligent hiring. Only in a peripheral way does the FTO program have some relationship with negligent hiring. And if you look in your resource material, you'll find a list of these areas that I'm going to cover, as well as some of the landmark or critical cases that you or your legal advisor may want to refer to if you're dealing with a liability problem similar to each of these categories. Again, in the first one, negligent retention goes something like this. If Officer X injures Citizen Y, and that's financially or physically, if Officer X injures Citizen Y, he will be liable to him. If Z, the agency head, if Z appointed X, and X was unqualified for his position initially, and here's the catcher, if Z knew this or could have learned this, then Z will likewise share liability with Officer X to Citizen Y. Now, how does the FTO program come into play here? Only if perhaps we've established some sort of a track record in the past to where we've identified that people with this particular characteristic or possessing this particular problem, people that scored at this particular level in some sort of a test, consistently failed in the program, consistently turned out to be unqualified, and the agency would continue to hire people like that. I think in a ripple sort of effect, the agency might be the focus of a negligent hiring suit, because in the past it's been shown that people of this nature, of this character, with these problems have been unsuccessful. So only, as I say, in a peripheral sort of way does negligent hiring concern FTO programs. But the next one, negligent retention, very definitely is in our ballpark. In negligent retention, it reads something like this. Again, if Officer X injures Citizen Y, he will be liable to him. If Z retained X, and X was unqualified for his position, then Z And let me back up. If Z retained him and he was unqualified for his position and Z knew this, the agency had knew this or could have learned this, then Z will likewise share liability with Officer X to Citizen Y. So in our example, perhaps, we may have an FTO program that has done about all that they can with a particular individual whose behavior is clearly libelous if it's allowed to continue. Poor officer safety issues, firearms problems, abuse of force issues, things that we know ultimately will get people in trouble. The FTO program makes the recommendation to the head of the agency. The head of the agency, for whatever reason, chooses to ignore the recommendation and retains that person. Should that person perform in such a way in the future that is consistent with the rationale that was used to recommend termination, it is possible that the organization, in particular the agency head, and anyone that participated in the retention of that individual, it is possible that they will be the focus of a lawsuit. Let me read you from a couple of others that we know to be of concern to us. The next one is negligent assignment. Negligent assignment says, the assignment of an employee to a position or task for which they are unqualified or ineligible. Now, I think your imagination can conjure up all sorts of examples, but a simple one might be to assign the trainee to operate the motor vehicle, going code 3 on an emergency run, when in fact you've never even seen them drive it under normal conditions. Or perhaps you have no sense of how well they're wrapped and how well they deal with the stress of situations such as a code 3 run. It might be that the FTO and or the organization would be the subject of a suit if somebody could show that we made a negligent assignment. Somewhat consistent with negligent assignment is negligent entrustment, and that reads, the requirement to prevent or disallow a person's use of equipment or materials with which he is not qualified to use. And examples of that include things like vehicles and firearms. So we see some similarity, but some difference with negligent assignment and negligent entrustment in terms of making assignments or allowing them to do things for which they are unqualified or ill-trained, and also entrusting to them certain equipment, materials, and so on, that, if used improperly, could result in damage to someone or something. Another area that is of particular concern to us in the FTO program is negligent training. Negligent training addresses an organization's duty to provide adequate and sufficient training for the completion of job tasks and assignments. It must be shown, however, to be a systematic failure to train with a pattern of similar incidents. Mere failure to train is not enough, but it must be reckless or grossly negligent that future misconduct is also inevitable. Now, there's a particular case that I want to call your attention to, and that's Pawpaw versus the city of Margate, New Jersey. Pawpaw, P-O-P-O-W, versus the city of Margate, New Jersey. In that case, not only did the court say that the organization had a duty to train, but it also had a duty to hire qualified persons, a duty to supervise, and a duty to terminate. So we want to keep that case particularly in mind, especially if you receive some queries from within your organization. They want to know, is it really that important that we follow through in the event that there's some poor training? And I want to reiterate another point. It isn't that just we occasionally or on a single instance may fail to train somebody. There has to be, in order for a suit perhaps to have legitimacy, what is called a systematic failure to train or a pattern of similar incidents. I think if you talk to your legal advisor, you'll hear words or phrases such as deliberate indifference or gross negligence, also areas of concern. If we deliberately ignore patterns that we have seen throughout the organization or with our employees or with a particular employee, or we are grossly negligent in terms of providing the proper resources or training or supervision and so forth, then we're liable to be the subject of a liability suit. Negligent supervision is another area of concern for us because the FTO is in fact viewed as the supervisor. Even though the FTO may be at the rank and file level in the organization, when they are charged with the responsibility for training, supervising the trainee, for making recommendations as to their retention or termination. Clearly, they fulfill all the roles and the obligations that have been set forth as those of a supervisor. So the FTO should give some consideration to their role in being sure that they properly supervise. Negligent supervision pertains to the requirement for the organization and or supervisor to provide proper supervision. And finally, or last but not least, is failure to direct. Failure to direct reads, it is the duty of the supervisor or administrator to A, anticipate problems arising in the course of operations. In other words, to anticipate that something might happen if you allow a trainee, for instance, to do a particular task and they have not been trained or they have not experienced that task. So to one, anticipate problems arising in the course of operations. Two, to minimize employee discretion at the operational level. And again, by explanation, you can't just turn your trainee loose without you having seen them perform in similar areas or without training to go perform a task, again, that might result in the injury to somebody or something. You just can't do it. Otherwise, you failed to direct. And three, of course, and this is more in line with the administration's responsibility, to write and distribute and train members in comprehensive written directives which guide behavior. So once again, a failure to direct is to minimize employee discretion, to write and distribute comprehensive written directives, and to anticipate problems that might be arising during the course of operations. Those are pretty much those areas of concern from a liability nature, but there's also another area we need to think about, and that has to do with due process rights. A trainee who is perhaps the subject of a recommendation for termination in the field training and evaluation program, in many states and in many jurisdictions, just because the jurisdiction has chosen to do so, that trainee has the opportunity or should be given the opportunity for what is termed an administrative hearing or a termination hearing. The United States Supreme Court has said in those instances where states or other jurisdictions have requirements for a pre-termination hearing and a pre-termination hearing is not given, that a post-termination hearing is illegal. Illegal to the sense that the person really isn't terminated until such time as they have their hearing, again, only if they opt to have one. So it is not, let me put it this way, the hearing procedure, the administrative hearing procedure, may be automatic in an organization, in a community, in a state. The trainee is not necessarily forced to participate in that, but the trainee has to be told that he has or she has this option, and if they choose to exercise their option to go through this administrative hearing, this pre-termination hearing, then we have the obligation to give them that opportunity. Those pre-termination hearings are fairly typical. It is an opportunity for the trainee to come in, present their side of the case, their rationale, why perhaps they ought not to be terminated. The FTO program then presents their rationale, its documentation, and so forth, and ultimately the chief administrator would rule on the recommendation following the administrative hearing. In most instances of termination, I want to be clear on this, that when I say termination, I mean in its generic form. It's the cessation of employment. In other words, employment ceases. My experience over the years is that most terminations result from resignations, not necessarily a firing. And I want to make this clear as well. One of the benefits, if you will, of the daily observation report and the constant documentation that is provided by the FTOs in those observation reports, the problems that the trainee is having really shouldn't be any surprise to the particular trainee. It is often that the trainees will come in and, in essence, give up the ghost. Realize that they're not cutting the mustard. Realize that the FTO program is doing or has done about everything it could for the trainee. And so the trainee will often come in and say, I just don't think I can make it. I would prefer to resign. Keep this in mind. The comment, resign or I'll fire you, is viewed as a firing. A coerced resignation is no different than a firing. So if somebody resigns, be sure that they have had the opportunity to perform, be sure that the documentation is there. It may well be that the decision to resign would be the trainees. It may well be it would be a decision that would be precipitated by a program manager or supervisor in perhaps a discussion with a trainee wherein the question might be posed, you know, what else can you think of that we can do? We've tried about everything that we can. We're not sure what else we can do. Have you any suggestions? It's been my personal experience that quite often the response from the trainee at that particular point is, I don't see anything else I can do. Maybe I ought to resign. Okay. During the course of these 8 segments, we have talked about certainly the key elements of the program, a number of them anyway, daily evaluation reports. We've talked about other forms and procedures in the program. We talked early on about the history of the program and a variety of things that are generic to not only the San Jose model of the field training and evaluation program, but other effective field training programs across the country. The last few minutes that I'd like to spend with you, I'd like to spend by telling you about an event that took place in the late 1970s when the FBI Academy at Quantico, Virginia, hosted what at that time was called the National Symposium on Police Field Training. Our audience at that time consisted of high-ranking members from 52 law enforcement organizations, police academies, and so forth. We made a 2.5-day presentation on the various aspects of the FTO program at the National Symposium. And when that program was over, I solicited input from a number of the participants. I asked them if they could provide to me, from what they had heard and from what they had experienced, if they could provide to me reasons that they might find for implementing the program in their particular agency. And from those answers, I developed what I call 10 reasons for implementing the program in your organization. The first of those reasons is it is a program that is consistent with EEOC guidelines. It is a valid program. EEOC guideline 1607.5A, as we've discussed in the past, speaks to content validity. This program, based on the job task analysis and the evaluation of the trainee based on their ability to perform the content of the job, is consistent with that guideline, and consequently, as we found, will get support from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the unlikely event that there will be a complaint by somebody that may have been terminated from the program. Number 2, chief administrators felt that this program would automatically lead to a support for department policies and procedures. Because trainees have to, or FTOs have to teach department policy and department procedures, automatically we feel that there is the introduction or the reinforcement of how the department policy should look and how the department procedure should be, as opposed to allowing an individual not of an FTO orientation taking somebody aside and poo-pooing or downgrading or minimizing a certain department policies and procedures. So there is built within this program then administrative automatic support for administrative policies and procedures. Certainly, number 3, as we've seen in just this recent discussion, the FTO program is likely going to reduce the number of suits for negligent hiring and negligent retention. Just the mere fact that we've identified people that cannot do the job and we've eliminated them during the FTO program phase is going to reduce the possibility of suits for negligent retention. Number 4, the program is cost-effective. It's cost-effective really for 2 reasons, number 4 and number 5. Number 4, it's cost-effective because we retain fewer people that cannot do the job. In fewer instances of the other officers have to carry the load for people that can barely cut it out there on the street. So we're turning out highly motivated, highly effective, productive people into the organization, and that in the long run is going to save us money. It's going to save us money in the area of liability suits, but it's going to save us money, and there is some sort of a profit, if you will, in providing service to the community. So we're turning out service-oriented people, highly productive people that will save us money. It is also cost-effective because people will get up to speed faster than ever before. I had occasion to speak to several precinct commanders or sector commanders in the city of San Francisco some years ago after we had initiated a program there. And one of them made the comment that was echoed by others in the room, "I'll take all you can send me." These people come to us following the FTO program at a production level equal to a 2- and 3-year officer from the past. So getting up to speed a lot faster is also cost-effective for us. Number 6, a very positive thing for the FTOs, and I was pleased that the administrators saw this, is that there's an alternate career path for the officer, or be he or she a corrections officer or a police officer, be them a communicator or fish and wildlife officer, that may be in that position for years to come, particularly in smaller organizations where an officer has little upward mobility opportunity, may be looking at a number of years ahead of him or her, pushing the black and white around. Here's an opportunity, another career path, if you will. Give them something different to do, give them something challenging, giving them something rewarding to do. So we have this opportunity, this other or additional career path, and that's a very positive rationale or reason for introducing the program in your particular agency. The 7th reason that I developed was that the program leads to an across-the-board standardization of policies, procedures, behavior, performance, whatever you have. Because the FTO program essentially teaches the same thing to the different people in the organization that come through the organization, ultimately we'll have a commonality of understanding of the policies, of the knowledge issues that are so important, and of certain procedures such as report writing, car stops, and so on. Number 8, increased motivation and morale for the FTOs because of the responsibility. The responsibility is perhaps more important than any other in the organization. It is the FTOs that are determining the quality and the makeup of that organization. An organization is good only as the people it hires. And if we do a good job hiring and a good job of training, we're going to have a good organization. So it's a turn-on for the FTOs to participate in that decision-making process that heretofore had been only in the realm of the chief's office, the sheriff's office. Number 9, again, for the FTOs, they practice supervisory skills before they take on that responsibility. It's been the experience across the country that FTOs are more frequently promoted and more frequently selected for specialized positions than people who have not performed that task. So it's a bit of a turn-on for them, but certainly it is an open door that may lead to promotion, a door that may well not be opened.
Hello and welcome to our special 2-part series on training the trainer. This series is primarily aimed at you trainers out there, and because we at LETN share your commitment to the best possible training for police officers, we'll begin today with a special review of some adult learning principles, and we'll develop a model of memory and function, and then work our way into the Schema Theory of learning, which is very important for understanding how people assimilate skills and then recall them later. Now, we're also going to look at the effect of conflict on the learning mind. In other words, how does stress affect us, and especially how does it affect our performance? Another thing that we're going to look at is the conditions of practice that promote both learning and retention, which is very, very important, and a very important distinction for trainers that we all need to know, and that is the difference between open skills versus closed skills. Now, throughout our time today, we'll be focusing on your role, the role of the trainer at enhancing the skills of the people you're training. Now, the part you play in learning is so critical to the success of your students. Now, LETN will later issue certificates of completion at the close of this 2-part series. You need to send us a confirmation that you have participated in both of these programs. That confirmation must be on your department's letterhead over the signature of a senior supervisor. You need to mail it to Neil Troutman, LETN Training, Administrator, 1303 Marsh Lane, Carrollton, Texas, 75006. And your certificate of completion will be forwarded by return mail. Well, now, to get started this morning, what we need to talk about is a model for performance, a model for how the mind assimilates information and then how it turns that into action. So we need to understand first is, how does the brain work? How do we gather information? How do we understand? If we first deal with the brain itself, and I'll just do a rough thing. This is my idea of a brain, all right? It's the best I can do, I'm sorry, right now. But when we're born, excuse me, the brain is relatively empty. Now, there's some things already stored in it, But the primary function of the brain is learn, learn, learn. Humans do that so effectively. As a creature, we have been the most successful learning animal there is. And yet very often we seem to be pre-programming ourselves for failure. And we'll show you some examples later. If we don't train properly for reality, we can have some real problems, especially as conflicts arise. So we need to understand, how does this brain record information? How does it recall it later? Now, the theory we're going to talk about is called the box theory of the mind. The box theory gives us a model that we can talk about as trainers. Now, this doesn't have any other meaning relative to psychology or anything else. This is just for us to have a workable model of the brain. Okay, so this isn't going to carry over into other schools other than learning theory. Now, the box theory says that the brain is going to take input all the time. The brain has extensions that it calls the eyes, the nose, for instance, the ears, all the senses, touch. This is a finger. I'll even put a whirl fingerprint on it to identify that. So I got sight, smell, touch, and then taste, the final sense. All 5 senses are extensions of the brain that take energy from the outside and transmit it into the brain. That's why the brain can learn. Now, for instance, vision, which is our primary sense, assimilates man as a creature. Probably about 90% of all learning that the brain gets, it gets from visual input. The eyes alone transmit to the brain about 1 billion bits of information per second. That's a tremendous amount of processing and analysis. What happens is photons bounce off an object, excuse me, whatever color the object is, it reflects those. It won't absorb those photons, and so it transmits that spectrum back into your eye. Your eye receives it, breaks it down into electrochemical response, and transmits it into the brain. Now, the part of the brain that we say receives input from a sense, we call a sensory register, and we'll just put SR up here, a sensory register. And at that point in the brain, that information is recreated for analysis. All right, vision, for instance, a sensory register for vision holds that information for a little under a second. That means every input is analyzed at that point for a little under a second, and then it goes away. This information is constant, it's constantly inputted, and yet it's got a mirror effect where it's actually analyzing and looking at it. Each sense has its own register. Smell, for instance, when it brings into its sensory register, has a tendency to bring up gestalt memories for analysis. In other words, when it brings it into its sensory register, it'll reach into the past and pull up whole chunks of recall for identification of the input that's been put in that sensory register. Hearing is the fastest of our senses. You hear about 20% faster than all the other senses. To do this, nature put a hole in your skull and put the receiving mechanism right against the brain. It's very important, of course, because you hear omnidirectionally. You see 180 degrees by 65 degrees. Therefore, for optimum survival, a creature that can analyze information that's coming in the form of sound from all over and analyze it effectively is going to have better odds of survival. Therefore, hearing analyzes in its sensory register about 1.5 seconds, which is a tremendously long time when we talk about the brain, 1.5 seconds. Now, throughout today, when I talk about the brain doing things, you have to understand that we're going to be talking in terms of milliseconds or thousandths of a second. And so when I say 1.5 seconds, that's an incredibly long time for the brain to do anything. Now, when hearing is being involved in analyzing, this is called echoic memory. Or in other words, the sensory register for hearing is called echoic. And once again, it's holding that information for about 1.5 seconds. In that time, the input is analyzed and reviewed. Now, what's remarkable is when you consider, for instance, when you and I are talking, say we're at a group with a group of friends, many of us are talking and inputting into the brain, and yet you're being able to attend to or pay attention to many different conversations. This is called the cocktail phenomena by scientists. I suppose if cops had invented it, it would have been called the beer keg phenomena. But what you have is that you and I can be at a party talking to each other. Somebody behind us says something about a football team that you really care about, and suddenly you're going to attend to it or turn around and say something regarding that. It's the same thing as when you're driving around your patrol car. You may have your AM, FM radio on. You'll have your police radio on. And yet, in spite of all this, you may be talking to someone else, and when they call you over the radio, your brain's going to analyze that input in that 1.5 second period and sort out what's important. The brain's always looking in sensory registers for what's relevant or what's important, and therefore you'll respond or attend to that radio input. the next level of processing past the sensory register. We have the senses receiving information, transmitting it into the brain for analysis, and that goes to the sensory register. From that point, the next level or the next box that the brain deals with information is called the short-term memory. All right, now the short-term memory is an interesting concept. When you start understanding there's really two different memory systems that we're going to talk about, short-term and long-term. Short-term is the hardest to understand. It's the hardest to conceive because what I'm talking about is an awareness of life. How do you and I know we're alive? Who's the being that wakes up in the morning? And this is the short-term memory. Really the best way to deal with it is just say it is an awareness. It is the conscious mind. All right, and that's the term, they're synonymous. Consciousness, short-term memory. It's very limited. Short-term memory can only hold any one thing for about 20 seconds. It's very, very limited in the amount of information it can hold. It can only hold 6 to 8 items for 20 seconds, and then they deteriorate dramatically. Because of this, for instance, the telephone numbers are 7. Now, those of us who are limited to 6, of course, have to carry the phone book to the dang phone. But there's been many research done that's confirmed this over and over. One famous experiment, in fact, the scientists had postulated that many human beings that had different levels of awareness or different conscious minds as far as their abilities. And one famous study, they took a bunch of chess masters and showed them a board, took the pieces off the board, and then 20 seconds later asked them to recreate the board. Some of these guys were putting 18, 20 pieces back on the board. It's tremendous. So right away, the hypothesis the scientists said is, see, some human beings have a different level of awareness. Another scientist came along and said, I don't think that's right. I'll tell you what I think those people are doing. I think they're reaching back into their long-term memory because the pieces you're putting on the board are based on a logical sequence as a result of a game or play. So let me put the board down abstractly, the pieces down all over the board, and then let's see how many pieces that these people can put back on the board. That was interesting because, as I said before, short-term memory for a human being is 6 to 8 abstract or separate items for 20 seconds. That's all it can hold information. These people who before had scored so dramatically higher than average people were now only able to put 3 to 4 pieces back after 20 seconds. 3 to 4 pieces. See, the brain, if it's not logical, if it isn't based on what the brain perceives as reality, for instance, you had a white queen next to a red queen, a white king next to a red king on a chessboard, these people, their brain wouldn't even accept that, could not remember it. So the conscious mind is very, very limited, yet it is really the essence of a human being. I don't care if you're a Down syndrome child or a genius, we all have the same awareness of life. And yet what's so critically important about the conscious mind is, or the short-term memory, is it's essential for learning. It doesn't do things well, but it learns so well. It lives life so well. So it's essential that we involve it in all learning. The next level of the brain, the next box of the brain, is long-term memory. The long-term memory is a great big box that contains more or less almost all the others around it. Long-term memory, LTM. This is the unconscious mind. I will use the unconscious and long-term synonymously throughout the day. There's some scientists, some psychologists, you hear the term subconscious. We're not going to use it because that means under the conscious. It's not all. Unconscious surrounds the conscious mind all the time. And the things that we store in our long-term memory are stored probably forever. For instance, forgetting theory says is that something is learned and it's encoded. Here's a little bit of information encoded in the brain, that it doesn't deteriorate over time and disappear. Instead, what happens is an event or knowledge will be surrounded by similar information. And so what happens is, it's called the interference theory of forgetting. In other words, it's hard to get at that engram of knowledge later because it's surrounded by so many other similar events or knowledge information. But it's still there. It's never lost. And so many times, events especially, you can remember the first event, the first time you ever drove a car, the first time you ever did this or that. You can remember very, very distinctly. You can't remember the 2nd, the 3rd, the 15th, the 20th. These things become lost, and this more or less validates forgetting theory, the interference theory of forgetting. So now the long-term memory, what do we store in long-term memory? Well, all your knowledge, all your experiences, more or less all your memory, so to speak, knowledge, if I could spell correctly. I like what Einstein said about spelling. It takes a small mind to spell things only one way, so I try to live up to his expectations all the time, all right? So we've got all our knowledge, we have all our memories, which are experiences. And remember, experiences are not things that happen to you. It's what you do with what happens. In other words, don't think that that's a basic reality. It's your perception of reality, and it's been modified and stored in your long-term memory. Also stored in your long-term memory are all your skills. Now, how these things are stored and recalled is very, very important. First, let's talk about how the brain stores knowledge. How does the brain store those things that it knows in long-term memory? Now, what we do is, if, for instance, you take a very small child crawling across the ground. I can remember the experiences with my kids. And you'd see this marker, for instance, is laying on the ground. Well, the first sensory input, or the first way the brain, the first input the brain's going to have knowledge for this will be a visual input, see. And once again, vision is the primary input for our minds throughout our lives. So the child will see this marker and store it. So now inside the brain will be this memory package right here of this marker. Okay, which of course I hope looks a lot better in the brain than that. Now, we can say, okay, this is the package for knowledge right here. And the next thing the child's going to do is reach out and touch it, pick it up. So it's going to get touch, and it's going to get the nature of this object right here. The touch of this object will be implanted in the brain right then. Then that child, of course, you all know, every parent's nightmare, this goes right to the mouth for taste. Now, the same time a child tastes something, it gets smell. And it's logging, the brain is cataloging in this particular knowledge package each of the traits of this particular item. Now, touch, so it's got, and under each one of these things is a particular category or information that stores it. The taste, the smell, the feel, all these things. It rattles it, shakes it, throws it. So now Dad walks in and says, oh, honey, look, you've got the marker. So the child gets a name. So now the child has had the experience, as well as it's getting an abstract that will symbolize this for the rest of that child's life, and that is the name of this object. Our great capacity as human beings is later on, the child doesn't need that object to be present. You can simply say, honey, where's Daddy's marker? And the child will remember, where did I hide that from Dad? So this is how knowledge is stored. This is how knowledge is packaged in the brain. Okay, what's important we have to understand is then that children then learn. We can say children learn through experience. All right, what we do is put these kids in a classroom and sit them down. We begin talking to them and using the abstract, which is the word. So after a while, we begin to rely on words. S.I. Hayakawa, in his book Language and Thought in Action, warns us very distinctly about using language too much, about relying on it too greatly in a culture. And as trainers, especially law enforcement trainers, we have become very dependent on the classroom of using the abstract or the word rather than the experience. The thing you have to understand is that adults are no different than children. They still need to have the experience. They still need to have the senses involved in learning. This is critically important. The more senses you involve in learning, like a child automatically wants to do. A child wants to touch, taste, smell, feel everything in its life. Adults still need those experiences. We learn too much about things in the classroom, not enough about things in the real world. Now we get into how we store skills, okay? Now you understand that a child has all this input about this information. You can talk about it, or the child can touch it later. Child or you can smell it later. And the minute these inputs are received in one of the sensory registers, the function of the sensory register is to tell that child or that human being that this is present in its reality, that one of these objects or that the information is present in the reality, and therefore the memory package will be brought up, including the qualities and nature of it. Also attached to it will be emotional responses. Do I hate this? Is this a threat to me? And this needs to be pre-programmed in the brain, because this is all done now at the unconscious level. Once something is learned, it automatically is done. We used to believe, motor scientists believe, that the short-term memory, the conscious mind, had to be aware of things. Now the theory is, and the belief is, that the short-term memory is really told by the unconscious mind what is the reality around it. In other words, it automatically tells you, you walked in, oh, look, I walked in the briefing room, there's a desk, there's a chair, there's the sergeant. Those things don't have to be processed. They're automatically identified for you unconsciously, and this creates the reality or the context around you, the life context. At the same time this is happening, things are given qualities or values. Kurt Lewin, the psychologist, said that human decisions were based on these particular types of qualities or values. He called them valences, the same type of thing we had in chemistry. And he says all our decisions then will be based on filling those valences or neutralizing needs based on a positive or a negative. An example, I can talk about a child walks into a room. Its life space is that room. As the child walks into the room, it's hungry. Therefore, it's got a negative input or a negative valence inside its little tummy. That child wants something. Well, there's the cookie jar up on the counter up there. You know, all good parents get a cookie jar so we can taunt our kids and have it up there. So what's the child going to do? That child knows that cookie is a positive that will fulfill that negative valence in that tummy. Now the problem is there's a negative in that child's life. In that countertop is a negative. It's a height. The child has to find something positive to overcome the height. So it looks around, oh look, there's Dad's stool that he used over on his reloading bench. The child reaches over, pulls that stool, falls over, trying to climb up that stool. Well, the child's going to give a negative valence to that stool and certainly not use it in the future. On the other hand, here's a chair that the child sees Mom using all the time to sew and do all these things with. The child pushes this chair over, gets up on the counter easily and gets that cookie. Now that chair is going to be given a positive valence. Now whenever the child is in that situation where that child needs to make a decision regarding fulfilling a valence, it will automatically see that chair is a positive for any height negative. And thus Kurt Lewin says we automatically make these decisions unconsciously. They're at an unconscious level reaching for a goal. And one of the things I want you to get thinking about is that all human beings are goal-oriented. And this is going to help us later, especially when we get into what we're going to call schema or skill retention, how we use skills in the world. A child used skills. Now, how are the skills packaged? And this is where a guy named Richard Schmidt, the University of Illinois, about 1975, presented us a theory that really fulfilled a lot of the issues about how humans perform. Now, he'd been an all-American gymnast, and as he was learning about motor learning theory, he was confused about how could we possibly learn if short-term memory was so involved in things. How could we do things later? The short-term memory, or the conscious mind, is very, very slow. Anytime you have to think about something or reason about it, it's going to take you about half a second, 4/10 of a second. On the other hand, you see people doing physical skills all the time that they do, quite frankly, in a tenth of a second. Batting, for instance, is about 120 milliseconds, the action of batting. You couldn't possibly do it if you had to think about it. So things have to be done in an unconscious response. This is where schema comes in. This is how we respond based on motor learning principles. Schema theory, under Schmidt, is very important because what he says is, as the brain is inputting all this information here, what's going to happen is each skill will have a scheme or a plan under which it will store information under two hierarchies or two informational sets of components. The first we call a recall hierarchy, or the recall component of a schema. The recall is learning the motor skill. Now let me show you briefly how this is done in the academy. This is very, very common that we're going to be learning motor skills. Let me bring in my lovely assistant. Richard, come in here. Now let's say we're in an academy and I'm going to learn a motor skill, and he and I are two cadets. That's right, we're in the academy and we're in the gym. That's right, yeah, well, we better be like we were in the academy. That's right. Now we're going to come in, and today we're going to learn controlling suspects. You know, we're early in the academy, and we're going to learn the Aikido wrist lock, which we all learned in the academy back years and years ago, because we knew that the most bad guys, the primary influence was, of course, grabbing our badge, right? So we spent many, many hours in the gym practicing controlling each other with Aikido wrist locks. And what's the first thing you tell your partner every time in DT class?
You make me look good, I'll make you look good.
That's right, yeah. Don't hurt me, I won't hurt you. That's right. All right, so now we know. So we take it, we're going to do Aikido wrist lock. You all remember this one? We reach across and we do it. Ooh, you make a lot of, and then when your partner does it to you, especially when the instructor's nearby, oh, God, oh, Richard, geez.
It's always good to go to the knees.
Yeah, go to the knees are essential. You guys take a hint on this next time. But this is the thing. So what is happening in the recall component is I'm first learning this skill. My body's learning how to do it. In other words, my body's learning how to recall to do it. It's learning the neural patterns of it, the muscular patterns, the joint. My brain has to learn how to remember how to do it. Now, this is very important early in the skill. Now, as the second part of the schema, or the second hierarchy is being formed, as we're talking about that, this is called the recognition component. R-E-C-O, recognition. Very long word to put on a little board like this. The recognition hierarchy, as the brain's forming it, is different. Now the brain is saying, where does this occur? It recognizes the context of the reality around where this skill will occur. And it also gives me, what future does this skill give me? In other words, what is the end result? And how successful is it? In other words, what's the probability of success? Now what my brain's learning is that in these confrontations on a mat in a gym with an instructor, that this is a relatively successful skill. But how is it going to work in the street? How am I going to perceive it in a real life context or reality? So what happens is later, suddenly we go out and we hit the street. We've been practicing this in the gym. Same thing, we practice our baton techniques. Years ago, all we ever did was 3 from the ring. 3 from the ring is great because you stand there and you strike the air. We did this half speed, and then we struck from batons 3 from the ring. First time you get on a fight in the street, I hope you didn't walk up and expect the guy to grab your badge, because that's not what a guy does, you know. The first thing
I've never seen that happen.
that doesn't happen. No, you walk up like that. Like,
Because your badge covered again.
that's right. Now you got a bloody nose and you still have a bad guy you got to take into custody. This isn't working.
But he doesn't have your badge.
But he doesn't. Your badge is safe, and that, I think, is critically important. Now, one of the things that I want you to remember is, when we're learning these things, the brain at the same time is still seeking that one to survive. It's going to say, what's the highest successful skill we have? We've learned 3 from the ring. Remember, we strike the air. Some of you may have been learning this years ago, trained in this years ago. It's like this, like this. Well, now we practice that, and we're going, man, it's just not the same thing. So now we get into a situation. We go into a confrontation in a bar, and suddenly this isn't Richard, our friend. This is his evil twin. So what are you going to do? You want to walk up to, no, you're going to end up resorting to those techniques that if you wrestled, you're going to go up and wrestle. If you boxed, you box. Your brain, your unconscious mind, your long-term memory is going to look at the reality, sort it out, and say, what is the future I project? All right, my current reality is, here's a dirtbag I got to get in custody. I want to project a future onto him. That is him on the ground cuffed. Now, if he's a dirtbag, he's projecting a future with me on the ground messed up. So what I'm going to do is say, buddy, you're coming with me. So I'm going to hurt him. I'm going to hurt him with whatever technique. I'm going to control him with what technique I'm comfortable with. In other words, my brain's going to project this future. Remember, you're always goal-oriented. So I come in, if I'm going to use the 3 from the ring, I won't do it if I don't believe in it. I won't use the Aikido wrist lock if I don't believe in it. I'm going to resort to those schemas or skills I have the highest belief in, the highest probability of success. Thank you, Richard, for being my bad guy here. So now, what's happening is my brain has learned the skill, which we're very good at in the academy, at teaching people the skill. But the recognition component, well, that is teaching people what is the present, what is the reality that this occurs in, and what is the end result, what is the future it gives me, and therefore what is the probability of success for this schema. Now, what I'm saying happens here is that all the time sensory registers are giving you input. This is put together by the unconscious mind as being the reality you're in. All the time, you're always projecting a future. And your brain, for every day of your life, for every minute, is finding skills, even if it involves just getting up and walking over to get a drink of water, to reach the future you want. Now, what's important for me as a trainer is to be sure that I train you to a level of skills in your schema where you'll respond appropriately. Now, as a trainer, it's important that I understand is that this model isn't so easy as it might look, because it takes a lot of training to fulfill this recognition component. Number one, we have to understand that this future has to be worked in. I have to show them a positive, realistic future that they're going to have and give them a high probability of success. They have to believe in the skill. In other words, if I take you out to the range and you shoot a gun, and I tell you, you just barely qualified, mister. You just barely qualified. Now that person goes into an armed confrontation and they believe that their score on the range absolutely transmits to their probability of success in an armed confrontation, then we've got a problem if they believe that's very low. If their self-esteem about that skill is very, very low. They're liable to fail, especially when we talk about the mind under conflict, under extreme conflict. So it's important that I'm modeling this. At the same time, I need to understand that schemas for different skills change relative to the type of skill, and that is analyzing the skill. Now let me clear off my board here a little bit. You should have your notes up here on this. I have to understand there's really 2 extremes or categories of skills I want to talk about, and that is open versus closed skills. Open versus closed skills. And I'll take a chart here and I'll create a little graph. And I'll say the end of this graph, the far end, this is closed, which I don't know how well this red is showing up, and this is open end. Okay, closed versus open. Now if I take a graph, and let's say I'm down here, let's put a meter on my graph, right down here, very, very closed end of the graph. And the game I'm talking about here is darts. And now let's talk about the nature of darts. Let's talk about the nature of darts, because it'll help us understand very distinctly the nature of these two different skills. In darts, I always stand the same distance away from the board. The board is fixed and it never changes. The darts never change. In fact, if you ever throw darts against real dart throwers, you know, they always pull them out of their coat and they got a green glow. It's like titanium kryptonite darts in case like Superman shows up at the bar. These people are ready. They have British Bulldog flights attached to their, they do everything. And they throw those darts like crazy. Now, it's a totally proactive sport. They're self-paced. They pace themselves. The environment is fixed. The board is fixed. Everything's fixed. This is a very, very closed skill. Now, success in it means I need to practice this skill over and over again, exactly into those parameters. Understanding also that how I attend to or how I focus on the skill is critically important, because part of the component of schema theory, we come back over here, when I talk about the recognition side, what I mean is your brain has to recognize where to fit this skill in. When does it occur? What's critically important then is I show you what are those attributes, what are those qualities about the present that make this skill occur. Now, those are things we call cues. Cues, just like one actor in a play will turn to another and give the other one a cue, the world gives you cues all the time to do things. Now, these cues are important. If you're a trainer, you need to find out where are the cues and what are they, and then you have to teach people to attend to them or pay attention to them all the time. Now, in darts, of course, the cues are going to be where your darts are hitting, and your focus or your attention will be very, very narrow. You'll be attending to a very narrow focus. From X, you'll be very narrow external looking at the board to focusing internally, calming yourself. And the key to success in this, and when you're modeling training for throwing darts, is to practice over and over and over again. Repetition, very much the key. Very, very fixed repetition. Now let's move over on the scale. Let's say I move down the scale more. Let's go over to football. Football, much more open sport. Football, okay? Now football involves 11 guys on one side against 11 guys on the other. Now suddenly the field's very dynamic. It's not fixed on. The environment's very dynamic. In fact, in a football game, the same 11 guys is never in exactly the same position across from the other 11 guys at any given time. Even the ball is very rarely in the same position on the field, just for very special events. So we can say that the environment's very dynamic, but even within the game of football, by side or position, it's more or less open. Offense, for instance, paces defense a little. Even though the offense is paced by the clock, the offense paces, or in other words, forces the defense to react to them. So what I can say is that while darts is proactive, football is more reactive. And defense is more reactive or more open than the offense. And the key, of course, when you're training people to be good football players then is to attend on a wider focus. In other words, suddenly they're learning for where the cues are going to come from. It's going to be a much broader environment than it was in darts. So I need to open up. I need to teach people to access cues from all around their environment. I mean, every pulling guard's dream is a linebacker with tunnel vision. I mean, this is why you pull guards out, because suddenly there's a hole there. The linebacker sees a fullback running at him. If he focuses too soon on that fullback, the last conscious thing that linebacker's going to hear is that pulling guard giggling. Because this is a dream for this pulling guard. You see this every day. This is why good coaches teach linebackers whenever they fill a hole that they're bracing for the impact, that they're automatically keeping their vision open and they're not focusing or getting narrow till right at the point of tackle on that fullback. Now this is called an open focus. Now what's critical to understand is a guy made research in this, and he discovered that under stress you're going to resort to the focus that you're most trained in. Now think about that for a minute. In darts, I'm training you to do narrow focus. In football, I need you to have broad focus. Football players get hurt because they tunnel. Sound familiar? Tunnel vision. Same thing that gets cops hurt all the time. Now ask yourself, where does police work fit on this scale? It's incredibly open work. But when we ask yourself, where does firearms training, traditional firearms training, fit in the United States? It's very closed. On a very fixed range. You're either at 7, you're at 3, you're at 15 yards, you're at 25 yards, and you're taught to pace yourself. The clock's running, but you're taught to pace your shots. You're taught to focus on your front sight, very narrow focus. Actually, you're down here around darts. When actually law enforcement as a profession is up here. It's the end of the open scale. It's absolutely open. If you were to ask yourself, What are we training? What's the world we're training police officers for? Imagine if a group of people came from outer space and landed and they were examining Earth. They wanted to go back and do a TV series about the planet Earth. They'd say, oh, quick, we don't have time to watch all these things, and we do want to do a series on Earth policemen, so run over to the academy and watch them train real quick, and we'll postulate, because we know that learning theory says that you want to, especially if it's open skills or closed skills, you're going to train relative to the skill. So we go back to our planet, and we create a series that next year based on what we've seen in the academy training called Earth Policemen. And it would open up, dun, 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 dun. All the police officers would walk in a briefing room. They'll come to attention. The sergeant come up, walk back and forth, look at them, drop them, do a few push-ups. They get up. They walk out in the parking lot. They get in their car. They back out of a bunch of pylons. They go out. They hit the street. They're on the street a couple minutes. Message comes over there. 342. Yeah, 342, go ahead. 10-4. Respond to 110 West Elm and shoot the occupants. 10-4. They'd pull up in front. There'd be little sidewalks spaced about 7.5 yards apart. They'd all run up to the 7-yard line. The door would open. A family in suits, strange creatures that are all shadow-like, would walk out. They'd stand like this. They'd turn like this. The officer would shoot them in the diaphragm. Then they'd turn back. They'd turn back. The officer would shoot a couple rounds. They'd turn back. Then they all go back in the house. The officer would leave. Because that's how we train. The officer would focus on that front sight. The key to success in an open skill is to make the cues as varied and dynamic as possible, to make the environment dynamic, not to teach officers to focus. See, the problem is you don't shoot somebody for being on the front sight. You shoot them for moving, for going for a gun, for trying to stab you or someone else, for endangering a life, and you have to see that. And you should only focus at the point that you're ready to actually shoot. Just like in football, you should only focus on the tackle point till you're right there in the position ready to execute the tackle. Otherwise, that pulling guard is going to smack you. And this is so important that we understand. So when you're designing your training under schema or learning theory, we got to make the environment as realistic as possible. This is where the context or the reality is so important. You've got to try to duplicate the context. You've got to have the people succeed to give them a high probability of success behind that skill. Make it as dynamic as possible. And be very careful when you have them doing repetitions. Now, there's some people out there say, oh, for any given skill, you have to do 1,000 repetitions or 2,000 repetitions. You can't really say that. But for every given skill, remember, there's various levels of learning that are going to happen here. Now, the very basic, the very first level of learning, we call the cognitive level. That's where the conscious mind is processing the learning. In other words, I have to consciously be aware of what I'm doing. Now, this is very, for instance, when you're learning to shoot, everything's uncomfortable. This is where the instructor's input is so critically important, because I have no knowledge of performance. In other words, what is proper performance for me? I need good knowledge of performance. The instructor is the only one who can give you that. They have to tell you how to hold your weapon, how to stand. If you teach isosceles or if you teach Weaver, I don't care. What's important is that you give your people good input. You correct their form early in the skill. Make sure they understand also what knowledge of results are. In other words, the knowledge of results is essential for learning. They need to know, what does it look like when I've done this skill right? What is a good result for this? I need to know what good performance looks like, and I need to know what a good end result looks like on my skill. Now I'm on the range, and it feels uncomfortable, officer. Okay, now I'm starting to feel better. Now I'm range master. This is feeling good. Now I'm in the second level of learning, the associative phase. I'm being able to give myself input about what good performance is. Same thing with the baton. Everything was so uncomfortable when you're first learning whatever technique, whatever type of baton. And now after a while, you're giving yourself, you can tell, yeah, man, that was a good impact on the bag. That was a good technique. You're giving yourself better and better performance. Now we get into the final level, and that's the most important one. That's the automatic or autonomous level of learning. Now, like I said before, I don't know how long it takes for something to get to that level, because every skill is different. But at the automatic level, whenever that cue is present in the environment that would stimulate that particular skill, you do it automatically and unconsciously. And once something is learned to the automatic level, conscious thought interferes with it. Let me give you an example. You get in your car starts. Backs out, it drives out, a red cue appears, your car stops. You don't remember driving to work. You don't remember driving. You haven't remembered driving in years. Yet you drive at a very, very intense level every day because you're a law enforcement officer. The people around you are driving all around. These people are all unconscious, and a lot of times, you know, a lot of the citizens are. But they are. They're driving them unconsciously. In other words, they've learned it to such a level that it's an automatic skill. Long-term memory is driving the car. Now, the one thing I can do to interfere with your performance, in fact, this is what we do as driver's training instructors. We bring you out, We say, okay, now move your hands. Nowadays, of course, we all do shuffle steering. We have your hands at 3 and 9. Now, how many years has it been since you felt the steering wheel? Suddenly, that's uncomfortable. I said, okay, now when you step on the brake, step like, imagine an egg under the brake. It's been years since you even consciously thought about applying the brakes. And now instead of going out and having you drive through lines, I'm going to put up cones. So now I've got you consciously driving your car. If you were trying to drive down the street that way, you'd be all over the road. But now I'm going to put you in a tough environment, and you're going to hit cones everywhere. Well, by the second day of driver's training with me, you're scooting through those cones like crazy because your brain has quickly assimilated this new input into a very well-developed driving schema that's already learned to an automatic or autonomous level. And now you're the next day, you skate right through those cones looking great. And who gets credit for teaching you? Me. But you're really the one who learned it. And your unconscious mind has now assimilated this new input. It doesn't take many repetitions if it's a driving skill. Another example is batting. A guy gets in a slump. Everybody statistically is going to have a slump. But the worst thing you can do is tell your kid in Little League, son, think about your stance. Or your little girl in softball, honey, check your feet when you're up there. If they've really learned the skill of batting, the conscious thought is going to interfere with a skill that's learned to a high level. But the key is, you want to get your cadets to learn their things to a high level. They've got to do it to the level. As the martial arts say, you learn it till you forget it. In other words, it's got to become instinctive. It's got to become an automatic, habitual response. This is where we have trouble. Because what we end up doing is we set up training that has repetitions, with enough repetitions where responses will become habitual, but we put something that's deadly into it. And these are called artifacts. An artifact is something you did to make training easier or to be part of the training repetition, which later reappears during the event and is detrimental to performance. A classic example is this: we leave cover out of training. We talk about it in the classroom, but people never touch, taste, smell cover. Consequently, they have no model for picking it in a crisis. And what you see time and again in officers in real shooting situations is they do exactly what they were trained to do, including all the artifacts of training. Remember, if I have you do it, you'll learn it. If I have you do it a lot, you'll learn it well. This is Brian Crandall out of Montana, is a trainer that developed a lot of contextual training up in that region, and this is one of his mottos. Anything you have people do, be ready for that to come back later under stress. Now let's watch a shooting and analyze what these officers do and ask yourself, why are they doing what they're doing? Now this took place in a large city a few years ago. A suspect has robbed a credit union. He's driving around, a chase starts, and we have helicopter footage, actual footage from the event. The guy has now escaped on foot and taken a hostage and is driving away. And the officer in the helicopter, or the helicopter pilot, sees the guy's going to get away, so he swoops down to block the road. The officers now move in on the pickup truck and are going to assault the suspect who has a hostage. The suspect is in the passenger side. He grabs the driver hostage, and will pull him over to him. And now the officers are going to take control of the situation. Now watch this occur. These are all men under a great deal of stress, and we're going to talk about how that decreases performance in just a second. But notice this. Now they shot the suspect who was still moving, and now let's go back in just a second here. What I'm going to ask you to watch is the relative position of all the officers. Ask you, why aren't they using cover? They've been told about cover. Well, they've never practiced cover. They never learned cover. They've been taught to go to the 7 or the 3.5 or the 15-yard line. That's what they're all going to do. They've been told many, many times, worry about, before you ever shoot a gun, think about your background. They were told that in a classroom. They've never practiced it. We don't practice these skills, and if you don't practice it, you can't learn it. These people are responding. They've been trained to be cops, to take charge, to control a situation. They are absolutely tuned to this situation. Notice that every one of them is trying to close in. They've run to the 3.5 or the 7-yard line. They're shooting. Notice the guy in the foreground, the nearest to us, is actually keeping his Weaver stance, although almost everyone else has gone to an isosceles. Notice as the shooting commences, you'll see an officer run up to the passenger side window and shoot the suspect almost point blank. The same time he does this, he takes a bullet, the officer does, in the nose. Let's go forward, Del, a little bit. Notice the officers shooting over each other's shoulders. Think of the risk here. This is a miracle that only one officer gets hurt at all. Notice the officer now is flinched back from the passenger side. Now they're going to open the door and pull out the driver. The driver is a hostage in this situation. Notice the officer with the shotgun. We rarely train with the shotgun until it becomes automatic in these stressors. He places a shotgun on the suspect. The suspect continues to move. So the officer tries to shoot him but has to close the action to shoot. And then he shoots the suspect. Notice the detective on the far side. If we could go back just a second, Dal. Notice the detective or the plainclothes officer on the far side actually is looking at how close to in line that he is relative to the shotgun. Now here's a real threat to people. Not only a suspect with a handgun, but everyone responding in this regard. Now this is so typical. This isn't unusual. These are human beings under a great deal of stress, performing exactly the way they were trained to be. They're cops. They're going to take charge. They're going to control the situation. But they've given up cover. They haven't touched, taste, or smell cover. They're going to run that deadly force program exactly. They haven't been taught to worry about background, so they're not practicing background. They're controlling that dirtbag right there. Now, this guy had done the movements. I mean, he precipitated this whole shooting. But the question is, what could we have done to improve, enhance the safety of those officers? Had they maintained cover? Had they had better fire control? Had they not created an almost complete circle around the suspect? This is so dangerous. These are things that need to be practiced on the range. Training with a handgun needs to be dynamic because it's a dynamic world. Schema theory tells me that open skill requires us to have people jump around and do things. They have to be involved in the total reality, because that's what we're really learning from all of this. Is that if you got a fight in a bar, then the greatest thing you do is take your cadet class to a bar and practice controlling people off a bar stool. Give them reality. On the other hand, if they're going to throw darts, they need to throw darts and practice focusing internally very narrowly. Remember, they need to learn where they're going to access the cues. What are the threats going to be? They need to practice keeping track of the hands of multiple suspects. They need to be told ahead of time because people do not naturally, instinctively know where to access cues, either visual or perhaps sound. I mean, there's all kinds of cues that need to be programmed. The more senses you involve, the more dynamic the learning. A great thing to try, next time you're on the range, after a string of fire, tell your people, everybody close your eyes and smell. What are they going to smell? They're going to smell smokeless powder. Okay, now they always smell that on a range. Many of them have never been in armed confrontations. The only place they've ever smelled that is in a safe environment. But now tell them, look, I want you to close your eyes and picture yourself on patrol. It's 3 a.m. You're on mids and you decide you want to get a cup of coffee. You go to your Circle K, but you don't see your person in there. You don't see that person who's normally, you don't see anybody in there. Now, I would not recommend you go in there. I'd honk and get somebody to respond, but you decide to go on in anyway. You walk in and the first thing you smell is that powder. Now, you better encode right now on the range while you can that this can be a threat to you. Now, what response? Go ahead and encode a response. Well, I'd get my weapon out, get back outside, take a quadrant of that building, get back up in there, get that building properly controlled, then get people in there. Because you might have a suspect in there. Very possibly you've trapped a suspect in there immediately after discharging a round. But you need to do this safely. You need to pre-program that cue, and the nature of the cue, whether it's a threat or not, needs to be pre-programmed in the brain. Once it's programmed, it's automatic. It doesn't require conscious thought. And remember, once you really learn a skill, once it's really learned, conscious thought interferes with performance, which then brings up human beings under stress, because we need to analyze how do these skills function, and I get under a real stress situation. And the way to talk about it is something that they call the inverted U hypothesis. The inverted U says that if I graph arousal, a human arousal. Now, what are the things that cause arousal? Well, those are the hormones involved, epinephrine and norepinephrine. They are released into your body, and your pupils dilate, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, your respiratory increases, certain enzymes are released, all kinds of things happen. You say, yeah, that happens every time I skin off. That happens every time you stand up. It happens every time you're sitting to something next to somebody and you turn to talk to them. Your body, this arousal occurs all the time. For every skill, everything you do, there's an arousal, a correspondent arousal. Now, if I graph all skills of arousal next to performance, yeah, good, this spelling thing here, I tell you. I find that every skill has an interesting response. Now, for every skill, as I get aroused, my performance will get better and better and better to an area we call peak performance. Real catchphrase in management and training circles. If I get aroused or get excited past that level, I see a drop in performance that's invariably sharper than when it went up. And this is true for every skill. You want to see this as an example, get a Nintendo for your little kids and watch them. You watch a little kid, and they're finally, all of a sudden, they're like World 7 of Mario Brothers 3, and they're 2 worlds beyond anything you've ever done before in your life. I watch my 6-year-old play, and he gets on that, all of a sudden, it's like, Dad, he's got mushrooms, he's got everything coming at him. All of a sudden, his man who was so competent 20 seconds before is frozen on the screen. He's frozen on the screen, going, Dad, take it. Son, you're 2 worlds beyond anything I've ever done before. But he can't move, and he gives it to me. His guy's promptly wiped out. And then it's my fault. But the point is, that is an over-aroused child there. And that's what you see police officers do. You see people do all the time in extreme stress situations. They go into this far end extreme, and that's a panic mode. And there's 2 forms of panic. It's flight or freeze. This fight thing, I don't know who brought this up, but you watch people in extreme stress, they either freeze or they run. These are basic innate things. They're essential for survival. You look at human beings who are designed to survive. Well, if you're out in the forest or the jungle and a saber-toothed cat jumps out down the trail up ahead of you, you're probably going to freeze. You're going to try to blend into the foliage. The trouble is, in the modern world, there's no foliage. We made this a monochrome world. We stand out terribly. There's not enough foliage around. So freezing doesn't do us any good, and running, unless you can run 1,100 feet per second, you're not getting away from the threats you face out there on the street. But what really gets cops killed is the fact that a lot of times you spend your whole day down in here, a low level of arousal. Now you're going on a hot call in a minute, you're going to be fighting for your life. But this is the 110th time you've been to that warehouse. So you're down here. You said, man, what kind of wind blows? This damn silent alarm goes off. This really, I don't even need a backup. Yeah, go ahead and take your position, Bill. I'll go up and check the door. Suddenly you're fighting for your life. So what happens is your people who are at this low level of arousal are suddenly thrown past their peak performance. It's so essential. You teach your people to play mental games with themselves. Ask themselves, because their body will respond to these games. Say, what if I pull up and this happens? What if I pull up? Now, that doesn't have to happen. The point is they'll have themselves aroused properly and be in this peak level of performance. Understand, too, that the more you practice for every given skill, the more aroused you can be and the greater your performance can be. High practice versus low practice. This should tell us something, gang. We've got to get our people training. And they don't necessarily have to physically practice. They can mentally practice. And also you need to understand that for every given skill, let me just make one thing critically important to all you trainers out there. For every given skill is this curve, right? And the more complex the skills become, the less they can be performed under arousal. Complex skills are very difficult to do under high levels of arousal because complex skills require more short-term memory. The brain's trying to take that short-term memory out under stress. Simple skills can be performed at very, very high levels of stress. Now, the military learned this much to their chagrin in Vietnam because they found their pilots were shutting down all these computers. Well, that didn't do them much good because there was too much feedback. Too much feedback. So what they had to do was simplify the display. Simplify, simplify, simplify. Keep it simple, because under stress we all become stupid. That part of our brain we call genius and brilliance is shut off. The brain doesn't need it. It needs to be reactive. So if you're designing training tactics for your people, keep them around 3 steps the brain can respond to under stress, and keep them very, very simple. That's why I've always been an advocate of speed loaders if you're shooting revolvers, because using fine motor skills begin to deteriorate. Things like the fingers don't work very well under high levels of stress. We need to make sure we train our people to respond to these things properly and deal with them. And now, finally, besides keeping it simple, besides having them affect all of their skills and learning all their performances and practicing and doing repetitions, I want to talk to you about giving them a positive future orientation. Now, this is very important because you have so much power as a trainer to control your people's performances. Remember I said before that the brain is always taking the present and applying itself toward a future. We are always future-oriented creatures. Now, we can have a positive one or a negative one. The brain doesn't care. It doesn't qualify it. It just simply goes for it. And it will scan the schemas in the middle based on our belief systems, and it will pick the schema with the highest probability of success to give us that future. Now, one great study a few years ago that proved this was that 80% of all high school injuries occur to 11% of the participants. These kids keep getting hurt over and over again. What they discovered when they analyzed these kids is, you know what those kids sat around and thought about all the time? They thought about getting hurt. They worried about getting hurt. And consequently, their brain will find it. Hey, if that's what you want, if that's what you're fixated on, we'll get it. Champions sit around and worry about winning. How am I going to win today? What will I do to? I'll never cease to surprise myself. Losers sit around and worry about losing. So you need to get your people to focus on how are they going to win this confrontation. Be positive toward them. Give them a positive orientation. When you're training people, don't ever criticize them. Always criticize only the performance and give them a positive orientation. Don't ever start your firearms class with, well, you women always have a hard time shooting. Because then if a woman does have a difficult time on the range, she's going to believe it's her fault because she's a woman. No, she's got a performance problem. Tell her, look, we're going to overcome it, no problem. Treat everyone, don't get your personal feelings involved in these people's performances. Treat them and deal with only the performance. What you want to do is give them positive belief systems. We're the first warrior class in any civilization that we give guns out without belief systems. And remember, before that officer can ever use that baton or ever use that gun, they have to believe that they are right in using it. So talk to them about their belief systems. Get them to believe in themselves, believe in the skills, and believe they deserve to be winners. As a trainer, you're the one person who can absolutely affect that. Well, I want to thank you for being with us today. And I want you to join us for our second special in our series 1 week from today. Now, our special guest instructor is going to be Bill Westfall. Now, he's going to be with us to share his expertise in liability and contextual training, and believe me, he's got a tremendous background in this. After years of law enforcement, he's been the director of an academy in Montana, and design training specifically, especially smaller agencies. Bill was an Alaska patrolman up in Alaska State Police, and he has been in remote situations in some of the ruggedest terrain in the world, and he has designed training to work. So he will talk about contextual training, as I mentioned briefly earlier, designing training that works effectively for people in the real world. Well, that's all the time we have today. Thanks again. Goodbye. Be safe. And we'll see you again on Training the Trainer.